So I was initially not sure that I would do a review of this movie or even see it in theaters, just because it is not listed as a horror movie, and after seeing it, it definitely is not a horror movie. Um, but I am committed to watching Ari Aster's movies, regardless of what they are or how acclaimed they may or may not be. And also, this one has kind of a personal connection for me. I am born and raised in New Mexico, and this movie is actually filmed in New Mexico and takes place in New Mexico in the story. So, that being said, I did decide to go see it, and I have some thoughts and some feelings. And so, this movie is meant to be a modern Western set in 2020 at the height of the pandemic in a small town called Eddington in New Mexico, which is actually not a town in New Mexico, but this was filmed in a town called Truth or Consequences, which I have been to a handful of times. So it was cool to see that sort of setting. And so the movie follows the sheriff of the town, played by Joaquin Phoenix, and the mayor of the town, played by Pedro Pascal, and this sort of feud that they have, most specifically about like COVID era procedures and policies. Emma Stone and Austin Butler play small roles in this one as well. In May of 2020, a standoff between a small town sheriff and mayor sparks a powder keg as neighbor is pitted against neighbor in Eddington, New Mexico. And so, obviously, being set in 2020, that is going to be the majority of the theme of the movie, right? And so, it doesn't have any shortage of themes to sort of work with and run with. So, you have things like COVID policies, things like masking, social distancing, as well as kind of some of the political tensions, some of the protesting, some of like the social media trends. So, kind of trying to recreate that atmosphere. Also, just themes of isolation, things about like indoctrination, being manipulated, and just like the general sense of uneasiness and anxiety that I think we were all feeling around that time. So, of course, when we talk about Ari Aster, there's always a lot in the execution. He has a very particular directorial style, and that one is very clear in this movie. Just like a lot of long shots, a lot of very like intriguing cinematography. It's well put together, well acted, well scored. Just overall, a very like intentionally made and professionally made movie. One of the criticisms that I had seen about this movie is that it doesn't directly reference the sort of Trump and MAGA stuff that was going on at the time. But it really focuses very heavily on like BLM and the George Floyd protests. I think you do get some representation of like the political dichotomies from the main characters, right? Because the sheriff is very much like anti-mask and talking about things like being controlled by the government and whatnot, whereas the mayor is very much like pro mask, and is like enforcing these policies within the town. Um, but I do understand some of the criticisms in that sense. And I think it does fall a little bit flat as far as addressing kind of like the overall attitudes and feelings of the time. I think maybe because it was so kind of complex and individualized, right? So some people were affected in other ways. And so trying to make a movie about this point in time seems like a pretty steep order. Um, and I think that definitely is felt by a lot of people who have watched this movie. Um, I am still sort of trying to decipher how I feel about it, and really trying to understand what it is trying to say, if anything. I think if it's just trying to portray like a sense of anxiety, it does that very well. But as far as like commentary, and maybe there isn't any, I don't know. I didn't really, I don't know. It's a tricky subject and it's a tricky time to sort of encapsulate. And I feel like maybe a few years down the road we might feel differently about this movie. But yeah, I don't know. It's interesting, to say the least. I think this movie really focuses on a kind of phenomenon that was happening at the time, where you have relatively disingenuous people, kind of typically white people, right? People who are using like language that maybe they haven't used in the past, and kind of the like trendy nature of all of this. And again, it's something that I think is really hard to fall on one side or another on. There's validity to it in terms of like people's outrage, and I think it's important that people were outraged, right? And it ends up being kind of like uh, the comedic element in this movie, which I think again is something that is for me not entirely a deal breaker. Like there are some like kind of funny moments when talking about this, but I can see how it definitely rubbed some people the wrong way. Again, it adds to this sort of like tricky thing, and I'm not sure where that like hesitation and that like reticence is coming from me. Um, but yeah, it's a difficult movie to make, and it's a difficult movie to talk about, honestly. I'm guessing that Ari Aster is like an older millennial, and you kind of really see that lens um, when you see the younger characters in this movie sort of interacting with one another. And so I think in some instances that might be a little in poor taste and just like a little uncomfortable for some people watching. I don't know. So aside from the overall content of the movie, a general pet peeve of mine is very long movies. This movie is about 2.5 hours long, and I really, like most long movies, I don't feel like it needs to be that long. Um, it was, I don't know, it just with the overall way that the movie was executed, I feel like I might have enjoyed it more if it was like 20 minutes shorter. So because this is not a horror movie, I can't really say too much about frights. There is some kind of gnarly gore towards the end of the movie, so if you go into this not expecting a horror movie, there are some parts that might be little tougher for it's Ari Aster, so he has to throw some like gross visual stuff in there. So it definitely towards the end there is some like visually nasty stuff. It's uncomfortable in a lot of points. It's tense. I think part of what it's trying to do is make folks feel anxious, and it definitely does that in a lot of different parts. But if you've seen like Hereditary or Midsummer, it's definitely not anywhere close to that. And all like the visual violence and gore sort of happens at the tail end of the movie. So I'll talk a little bit about spoilers in the next bit. So if you are waiting to see this one and trying not to get any additional information, stop the video here and come back after you've seen it. So I won't talk too much about spoilers just because I don't know. This is a weird review for me just because I don't have super strong feelings about this movie. And it's not something that I would have watched had it not sort of had the New Mexico Ari Aster connection. I am not a Westerns person, and I frankly don't really feel like at this point in my life I need a COVID movie, a pandemic movie. Um, so it's hard to talk about because I don't know. But I think the best part of this movie is the last like 20 to 30 minutes, because you have this really slow build into Joaquin Phoenix's character kind of spiraling out of control, and it leads to this scene where he's fighting with some like unnamed, unexplained rioters, or I don't know. I might have missed something, but that part's never really explained. It's just like random people showing up to this town on a plane and then like spray painting a bunch of stuff and like blowing things up. So Joaquin Phoenix is just kind of running around this small New Mexico town with this giant gun just like shooting off. And so that scene is really fun. And you have the kind of Ari Aster like long panning shots. So that was cool. Of course, I could have used more. I could have used more chaos, more gnarly stuff happening. But that's just, I the reason that I love Ari Aster so much is because of Hereditary and Midsummer, and so going to see this, while I do want to like see what he does and support what he does, this movie for me could have used like way more chaos, way more intensity, a la like Beau is Afraid. For those of you who've seen that one, so it's very tame for an Ari Aster movie, and I feel like that was my like main issue with it. There's a lot of stuff that's like peppered in and out that isn't really like explained. Specifically the that thing that I had mentioned earlier about the people running around shooting. There's no real explanation for that. And I don't know, the sort of cult stuff with Emma Stone and Austin Butler is over very quickly. It's kind of like a side story that doesn't really didn't really resolve or go anywhere for me. I think it was sort of meant to exemplify this like cult type thing, or like people being easily influenced or whatever. But it just didn't stand strong enough for me personally on that. Overall, I think it's an interesting premise. It's not something that I would probably watch again. Um, yeah, I don't know. For me, it's a personal. It's 3 out of 5. Like it's a movie, and I didn't hate it. But it wasn't something that was made for me. It's not something I would usually watch. And yeah, I'll just kind of leave it at that. I had made a video on my TikTok prior to going into the theater, sort of making my predictions for what New Mexico stuff might be represented in the movie. So I had guessed things like Zozobra or the Balloon Fiesta, green chili, the sandias, the world famous Frito pie from the Santa Fe Five and Dime. None of those things were in the movie, except there was a little homage to Zozobra, which is something that we do here. It's kind of like a cleansing thing where you have this big like paper puppet that's supposed to represent like all the bad things from the year, and then he like goes up in flames, and that's supposed to like kind of cleanse our bad stuff. And so there's like a scene in the movie where there's like a depiction of Zozobra on one of the buildings. And I feel like it had something to do with like the random person running around and blowing things up and like spray painting stuff or whatever. Um, but anyway, so they they didn't mention some of like the quintessential New Mexico stuff that I was hoping for, which was a bummer. But it was cool to see Truth or Consequences. It's a just like a tiny little town that I could recognize some of the streets and some of the buildings, so that was fun too. One of the other things is that I feel like Pedro Pascal's character was kind of snubbed in this one. He and his son are shot by Joaquin Phoenix, and that kind of just is the end of that arc. And I feel like it happens so quickly and then sort of unceremoniously. I don't know. I mean, yeah, I don't know. This is definitely a weird entry into the pre-existing Ari Aster movies. It's a departure, I think. Um, Whether that's good or bad, I don't know. A lot of the reviews I've seen, people have this kind of feeling where they really want to, stay on board for what comes next, but people were already kind of skeptical with Beau is Afraid, which I did like. Again, did not need to be that long, but I digress. So I don't know. I'm curious to see what Ari Aster comes up with next, and what I would love for him to go back to, like the Hereditary Midsummer. I feel like he does that best, but I'm biased just because I want everything to be a horror movie. So I don't know. We'll see. I will continue watching whatever he does put out, though. So I apologize. This is kind of a weird review. I would love to hear other people's thoughts about the movie, what they sort of took away from it, whether you feel like it fell flat in some areas. I don't know. Yeah. But I will be back hopefully in the next couple of weeks. There's a couple things coming out in August and September that I'm looking forward to. So definitely tune in, subscribe if you haven't already. I also post pretty regularly on TikTok and Letterboxd, as well as Instagram.